For my next guest, being abandoned at a shelter on Christmas Day was not the plot of the next Lifetime holiday special. It was real life in her life at 16 years old. Now, she is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar business ranked in Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies in America for 3 years in a row. Today, she's going to share the story between the beginning and the end and the lessons that she learned along the way. Vulnerable and strong, relentless and relatable, outgoing introvert, Natasha Miller. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Meredith. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate your paradox so much, and I love how much of who you are does not fit in one category. It just makes my little heart happy. So
It is so ironic. Everything makes no sense. And, the two of us introverts
right.
will revel in that.
Yeah, there's that part too. But I think that's what makes people like you interesting. It makes you noteworthy. It's not predictable and it is a paradox. So maybe we could start at whatever you consider the beginning. I know about being dropped off at the shelter when you were 16 years old on Christmas Day, and literally that is it. So what kind of happened leading up to that point?
Interesting. The beginning really is at the very beginning. And I didn't learn this until I was 24 and pregnant with my daughter. But my mother, when she was pregnant with me, my mother and father didn't tell anyone. And I was almost 9 months old before anyone knew I existed.
What?
So that is not a great start right there.
No.
And I do write about that in the book. And it's interesting. My grandmother came over and knocked on my mom's door. And my mom had me in a room, and there was a baby bottle on the counter. And my grandmother said, are you babysitting? Or what's that bottle for? And my mom's like, oh, I'm just babysitting. And my grandmother went back home and was meeting with, she was a social Catholic. And so she was meeting with a priest at her home, and she was telling him about this. And he said, I think you might want to talk to Marty, her son. And that's when the secret of me came out.
Wow.
So if if anyone's a parent, they know how challenging having an infant is. It's just, you can be the most patient, wonderful person on the planet and still want to lose your mind if your baby won't stop crying and all that stuff. And I suspect that as a baby and a toddler, I was likely not treated well, especially since I was hidden.
But you don't have memory specifically of any of those moments?
Not as a baby. My first memories probably started around 4. And, most of them are not pleasant, especially when it has to do with my mother. I did have some interesting soft moments in my life where I felt I was being cared for and taken care of by my father. And he was like the most incredible father you'd ever want, except for the fact he did not protect me from my mother, from her rage, from her physical and mental abuse. He just didn't know how to handle it. And that is not an excuse that I'm making for him, nor is it an excuse he feels is appropriate, but it's just how it was.
It's just the truth of it.
Yeah.
So what did your mom, are you comfortable sharing? What did she do that was a part of, paint us a picture of what that life was like that would lead to her deciding, you know what, because if you drop somebody off on Christmas Day, I feel like that's not really well thought out. Like it probably came to a boil. So paint us a picture of what that looked like coming to that point.
Sure. So growing up, all I knew was fear from my mother and the hatred she had for me. How did I know she hated me? She told me every day.
Every day.
I hate you. I'd rather kill you and get it over with and go to jail than have to look at you. And I had 2 younger brothers that were 4 and 8 years younger than I was, and she adored them. She went to all of their hockey and baseball practices, and she was always sick, quote unquote, when I had a symphony rehearsal or a recital. And so my poor brothers had to watch me being abused by her, both mentally. It was mostly mentally, emotionally, verbal, with some physical abuse thrown in there. And honestly, that wasn't the worst part, right? For me, the physical abuse was not the predominant thing that I look back on. But if you scoot up toward age 16, I was told by a therapist to stand up to my mother. And on Christmas Day, we were prepping for dinner. And I think she said something to me, and I thought this was the time for me to stand up for myself. And I don't know what I said, but she lunged at me with a butcher knife and started chasing me around the house. And I felt like for the first time, there was a change in the tenor and the timbre of her voice. And I felt like, oh my God, this is it. She's really going to kill me. And so she was pushing me against this big bay window, and her nails were, going into my neck and my arms. And so there were some abrasions that were visible, but in the mid 80s in Des Moines, there wasn't the kind of domestic violence help that the police could give. So they gave my dad a card that said Youth Emergency Shelter Service on it. And they said, if you want to take her somewhere for her safety, you can take her here. Now, here's where one of the ironies comes in, and it's not the first one, but what was my dad's job at that time? He worked for the city of Des Moines in charge of the Homeless Coalition grants and programs.
Wow.
So this shelter was under sort of his jurisdiction.
Oh, interesting. That is when we think about the situations that have a headline, if you will, teen dropped off at shelter Christmas Day, that is not the family picture that we imagine, right? We don't imagine a family with 3 children who go to extracurricular activities. And we don't imagine 2 parents, and we certainly don't imagine one of them being in charge of anything health and human service related.
Here's another irony. My dad's mother, my grandmother, wrote professionally books to help families communicate. So she was signed by a major publishing company in New York and wrote books called Help Your Child for Life or To Share with Your Children. So she's out there helping families while her own son and family is disintegrating.
Okay, so this is a lot to unpack, Natasha. And I'm sorry, first of all, that happened to you. That's really tough. I feel like psychological abuse is often viewed as less severe than physical abuse, and it's tempting for survivors to word it in a way. But they never hit me, for example, is commonly said.
Yeah.
And so I want to just, recognize that sucked, and I'm sorry that happened. Did your mom have a mental health challenge that caused her to funnel that behavior towards you only? I feel like there's a lot of missing pieces here.
There is. Well, there was a mental illness element, but it wasn't officially diagnosed. But I would say from other professionals that she was bipolar or is bipolar. To what extent and what grade, I have no idea. She did not have a good childhood either. And, we're learning more about that now, but she lashed out at me specifically and not my brothers. However, I don't think she treated them incredibly, but she just didn't harm them in the same way. So I think watching her abuse me is a form of abuse, right? For these poor kids, they are helpless. They can't help their sister. But what I found out at the end of writing the book was something that I think has to have had something to do with it. And that is, I found out that I had a sister that's 5 years older than I am.
What? That
my brother, Justin, had been holding this secret from my mother for the last 20 years, but never knew who the sister was. she told him when she was going in for a surgery, she may die. If I die, here's some information about this child I had if you want to look for her. My mother did not die. And the sister's name is Nicole. So Nicole and Natasha, and both of my brothers have J names. So it was interesting.
Huh.
She may have been harboring, having to give up this daughter. She had this daughter for a year and then had to give her up for adoption. And not completely sure why, but back in the late 60s, it was illegal to have an interracial marriage. And the father of the baby was Black. And it just was really tough. I also don't think that the father of the child wanted, a committed situation. So
Wow.
she was in a tough spot. Definitely some tough situations that she had to endure. And I honor those, but also I had horrible situations to endure. And I've been incredible to my daughter because I've chosen to fight to be for my daughter what she needed.
And who you needed to be for yourself,
Absolutely.
I imagine, as well. Did her behavior become apparent to anyone in your life? You had all these extracurricular activities, or at least music I know of, and then it sounds like your brothers had them too.
Yeah.
There was no coaches, teachers, or anything that were aware and who advocated for you?
No. So I really think it was a sign of the times and maybe the socioeconomic place that my dad and mom were in, not necessarily his mother. His mother was very well, beautiful home on the top of a hill, authoring books, and eventually became a college professor at Drake University. So pretty uppity,
Yeah.
But no one, I was waiting my whole life to be saved.
And it just never happened.
No, and I think, the thing is that no one's going to come to save you, and you have to save yourself.
How did you even begin to make that shift between having a daily proclamation that you were hated and unworthy and internally to shift that to a healthier state?
Wow. I mean, I was just fighting for my life. I was fighting for safety. And then I was fighting to scratch my way out of this dark hole and into a place that I wanted to be different, in differently. I don't know why I survived. I don't know how I survived, but it was this sheer will to get to where I wanted to go and out of where I didn't want to be. So it was survival mode.
And that involved obviously the mental aspect of surviving. So your dad dropped you off at this shelter, which government wise he was in charge of. And then what? Walk me through, he drops you off Christmas Day. What happens?
I'll tell you, and this is what you hear about from a lot of survivors. Eventually, I just wanted to go home, even to the mess that was there. It was the mess I knew, and it was more comfortable than me sleeping in a bed that wasn't mine, getting lice, being chastised by the other kids, missing my violin lessons. I don't know if you'd call me a prodigy. I guess in my community I was, but in the greater sense, I probably wasn't like Itzhak Perlman potential. So there was talk about me going to foster care. My dad actually entertained that.
Wow.
And I realized quickly that if I were to go into a foster home, I could be 200 miles away from Des Moines and I wouldn't be able to study with that professor at Drake University that I was studying with. And so I was like, nuh-uh, this is not happening. So I found a law book in the office and I read it. And I think I was guided to this book by one of the counselors, and I can't remember exactly how I came to this book. But I realized that I was an abandoned child and that I could be emancipated. So in Iowa, there wasn't a real emancipation law. So I was basically emancipated. And I lived on my own from that time on.
So you were 16 when you entered the shelter, and then what, you just got an apartment?
I lived with my grandmother, my dad's mom, for a time, and then I ended up in an apartment. And the sad story about that is my grandmother was very lovely and caring and wonderful and a safe harbor for me before I came to live with her. But the demons that maybe made my dad the way he was came out when I became a ward of hers in her home. So I was also treated not well by her. And, one of the things in the book that I talk about that I didn't understand was a trigger warning, was that I started to self-harm myself when I was in the care of my grandmother. And so for me, that meant I was digging a hole in my chest. And there's still a scar there today. We didn't know about cutting back then. I mean, we weren't very educated on anything about mental health back then.
Well, and you're
So
talking about the Midwest. I mean, I'm from Nebraska. It sounds like you and I are not far in age, apart. And so I was in Nebraska in the 80s and the 90s. And so I really sympathize with that. And although I understand what you might be feeling like, this is so unbelievable that no one would advocate for you and no one would know about these things. But was it really? I mean, things do start on the coast and then they move in. And so that information and the knowledge of how to advocate for a minor, it just probably was not there. I mean, the only thing
I just had Oprah, that would have been amazing. Like,
actually, yeah, it would have.
She really opened up and Phil Donahue and, all these shows would have opened up the potential for someone to see what was happening to me, because people were seeing it. They were hearing it, but nobody knew what to do. And honestly, I'm not sure there was anything to do.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, certainly there would be more resources now, but I see your point. Like, maybe what would they do if those resources back then didn't exist? But it sounds like you were able to, by some miracle, find your own resources within and use these events as transformational moments to your life. And I'm curious, did you recognize in those individual moments that this is a transformative event? What was your self-talk like?
No, it was all survival. I couldn't reflect. It was too soon, right? And too soon, too young, not educated, didn't have the lingo, didn't have the language. All I did was just continue to work my butt off to be the best I could at anything that I was good at. So that's a thing that, I started doing calligraphy. I was kind of artistic. So most people can become good at something that they love and just have it as a hobby, but that wasn't an option for me. I had to turn every skill that I had into a potential revenue center. And so there was some entrepreneurial spirit in there, but I'm not sure I would have that if I didn't have, the situation that I was in. I don't know who I would be if I were treated the way that I was.
And the people that make the biggest contributions to society, who are the most, motivational, who really offer society perspective because of the hardships, those are the people who went through all the stuff. And so as a parent, I'm wondering, how do you balance internally that struggle between giving your child a good life and then instilling in them the grit that we know is so important for being a good member of society?
Well, the truth is, I was an excellent mother to Bennett. She would also agree with that. However, I'm able to look back, she's 26 now, and understand that I did overcompensate. And this is something I have to work on every day right now that I've realized it. I don't want her to feel any pain. I don't want her to feel any discomfort. I try to swoop in and save her every single time, and it is not helping her. So financially, with her career, with school, with anything. And I'm really just trying to save myself. Right? And so I've got to stop doing that. And I really have to talk myself down. And you know what? She's at the age where she knows I shouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And she knows it's not good for her. So we're trying to figure that out. And it's not fraught with friction. It's actually my daughter Bennett saying, Mom,
you're doing it again.
you're not the little girl from 29th Street. Like this, you don't have to do this.
Yeah.
I've got it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but, okay, I'm putting myself on mute. I'm hanging up. I'm turning around. I promise I will not come in and save you.
When you think about the younger generation, or just maybe even other entrepreneurs that you come across, and the difficulties that naturally come up with running several businesses, how have your experiences affected your baseline of what adversity is compared to other entrepreneurs, other young people your daughter's age?
I would think that I know I'm more empathetic, because if something goes wrong with an employee, with a vendor, with a client, my first reaction is, what's going on in their life that's making them react this way, that's making them lash out, that's making them high maintenance, that's making them, untrustworthy. And that's where I start, where instead of, oh, that person, right? Shame on that person. They're no good. They're not excellent. They're not, I really do stop and think about that. And I don't think that's something that I learned from someone telling me that's what I should do.
It's interesting how, as you said before, upbringing changes different people. Your mom had a certain reaction, your dad and your grandma all have these different reactions, and your response is, the pendulum swings. And so it sounds like your pendulum has swung towards like ultra compassion, maybe.
It has. And I have to admit this, because as far as I've gotten in life and as far as I've recovered mentally and such, I'm still a work in progress. I still have some pretty big things to get over and polish up. And one of those things is when I'm in an intimate relationship with someone, I'm not my best self. I let myself kind of fall into behaving similar to my mother and my grandmother. And it scares me and it makes me so upset. And I've kept myself from relationships because I don't want to see that side of me. And, I am in therapy and have been for a long time on and off. And my therapist is like, you're not going to be like that again. And I'm like, I wouldn't be so sure of that. Like, I don't want to know. I don't want to risk it. So this is something I'm working on, is trying to mentally tell myself that I will not treat people that are in that position unwell.
Interesting.
Work in progress. Let you know later.
Well, thank you. Well, give me an update later. Well, what you're saying is so vulnerable. And I mean, we are literally from neighboring states, right? Yeah. And maybe it's just my interpretation of that region of the country. So I don't speak for every Midwesterner, but I feel like vulnerability is not really what we're known for. You know what I mean? Like, we're known.
I've lived in San Francisco Bay Area now for 27 years. And even though I'm not really a charge your crystals in the moonlight girl, I'm definitely about vulnerability and saying the things that are tough out loud. I'm also at an age where I feel confident that I can say this because I have a lot of history and success behind me. And I know that it's helpful to other people, some other people, not everybody, but if somebody hears this conversation and they're in a place that I was at in the past, that they might think, oh my God, if she can do it, I can do it.
So your motivation to be vulnerable, although it goes against your natural inclination, is to help others.
Absolutely. And 2 years ago, I didn't talk about any of this to anyone. In fact, all of the people that know me personally and professionally, if they read this book, they're going to be like, what the hell? They will not understand.
Yeah.
And it's not that I wanted to keep it this huge secret. It just wasn't something that came out.
Yeah.
And yes, I would share little things here and there with people, but I started practicing talking about this at the Inc. 5000. I remember it clearly. I was in a room with a bunch of speakers, people that own billion-dollar companies. And I stood up and I said, I'm writing this book and I'm going to practice now being vulnerable and telling you about what this book is about, because I know I'm going to need to do this in the future. And I stumbled over my words and everybody's attention, because what does everybody want mostly? They want something for themselves, but this room quieted down and they leaned in and they were just riveted. And I think they were showing their support for this new thing that I was trying to do. And, it's taken me a lot of practice, but now look at me. I'll just tell you anything.
Well, what do you feel like is the greatest overreaching lesson that you've learned from the experiences that you've had up until this point? From the abandonment and the abuse and the figuring out how to rent an apartment as a teenager, does all of it come together into one grand lesson that you feel like the world needs to know about?
I do think the big lesson is no one's coming to save you, and you can save yourself. And to amplify every opportunity, whether it is positive or negative, to its fullest extent. It takes work. It takes grit and determination, but what else are you going to do?
So,
I would lean on that and focus on moving forward rather than, feeling bad for yourself and that thinking that nothing's possible. Everything's possible.
that's a big lesson to learn. Those are definitely words easy to say, but harder to walk out. But if that is something that someone can grasp even a fraction of, I think, the world will be a better place for it. So I'm grateful that you've written your book, and I would love for you to tell people where they can find it.
Oh, yes. Thank you. So the book is called Relentless: Homeless Teen to Achieving the Entrepreneur Dream. And you can go to officialnatashamiller.com and learn more about me, but also find where you can access the book.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And thank you for allowing me the time to be vulnerable.
Hey, you're still here. That's awesome. I hope to see you next week too. I talk with the most interesting people that you've probably never heard of. Most of them are paradoxical and bring an opportunity for you to grow as a person. So if you like bright, meaningful entertainment, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications.